Hello, fellow cyborgs, and welcome to my May reading wrap-up. The bulk of the reading that I did in May was during the Springathon and also rereading the Princess Tales series. I made individual wrap-up videos about both of those, and they will be linked down below. However, there were 2 straggler fiction books that I read in May and a bunch of children's picture books. I'm trying to purge my bookshelves, and I wanted to reread these children's picture books before deciding if they were going to stay on my shelves or be donated. First, however, I will touch on the adult fiction books in case you're not interested in those picture books. I listened to the audiobook of the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. This was part of Acacia from the Chaotic Little Book Corner's Patreon book club. This is a horror novel. Previously, I have read my best friend's Exorcism by him and really enjoyed it. So this being a part of Acacia's book club really knocked me in the butt to actually read it sooner rather than later. There were many things that I really appreciated about this book, but 2 things that made me lower it a star. Let's talk about the good things first. So this is set in the late 80s, early 90s in Georgia, maybe in the South. We follow our main character, Patricia. She has a group of friends that are in a book club. Very quickly, this book club morphs into reading solely true crime books. In fact, the different sections of this book are headed by the different books they're reading in the book club. Some of these true crime books are also heavily referenced within the text, which I really appreciated. Patricia and all of her friends are distinct characters. They're varied and they are so lifelike. I really loved how they supported one another and came together. I also love how this book validates the physical and emotional labor required to be an unemployed wife. And in fact, this physical and emotional labor becomes key at the climax of the story. I also really appreciated the vampire mythology. It was a little different from what I had read before, and I always love when these things get played around with. Just because it's been one way before doesn't mean that you have to stick with it. I was a little bit confused that the word vampire is in the title so that you are immediately alerted to what is actually going on, and therefore a part of the suspense is not there for you. But overall, I think that this did end up working, and the revelation that the villain is a vampire is not as important as the other things going on. However, that's not one of my main gripes. I just something I noticed. One main gripe is that the elderly, specifically their bodies and eating habits, are used as kind of gross out horror. I don't like this. I think that it is already too easy to dehumanize the elderly body and the elderly experience. It is already too easy for people to be a little bit icked out by things that happen when your body starts breaking down, and we didn't need this. The other main thing is at the about 3/4 mark of this book, there is a rape scene. Had I known there was a rape scene going into this, I probably would not have picked it up. I'm very sensitive to that. Also, it seems to me that the rape scene's function was simply to show just how bad the villain is. It has another consequence, but I'm not going to get into it. And frankly, by this point in the book, we already know how bad the villain is. We don't need this rape cherry on top of the awful cake. I also think it's just an incredibly overused trope to cause suffering to female characters. I didn't think it was needed, and I didn't particularly like reading it. So if those 2 things had not been in there or had been downplayed more, I would have given this 4 out of 5 stars. But because of it and my personal preferences, this is a 3-star read for me. I do still really enjoy Hendrix. I would be interested in reading more by him. I think that he is writing the sort of horror books that are to my liking, but this one just wasn't quite as good as my best friend's Exorcism. I also reread The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I was buddy reading this with one of my friends, and I actually listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by Jim Dale. This is the 3rd time that I have read The Night Circus, and the 2nd time I have listened to the audiobook. I loved this when I first read it, and I was surprised by how good it was, and I still love this. I love this because the atmosphere of autumn and wonderful circuses is just so tangible and lovely. And I also love this because somehow, even though there is tension and not everybody's happy and there's even deaths in this book, it somehow still remains cozy and it just feels safe. This is the sort of book that I was thinking would make a perfect audiobook to listen to try to fall asleep, because there would be no section that I would need to be worried about making me more awake than sleepy. Every time I read this book, I find another detail that I had missed before, especially surrounding the side characters. And every time I read this, my opinions on some of the main characters become more nuanced. I love this book so much, and I definitely think that one day I might upgrade my physical copy to a more beautiful one. And one day I might actually purchase the audiobook as opposed to continuing to borrow it from my library. I still loved it. 5 out of 5 stars. Highly recommend The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. So now I have 12 children's picture books to show you, so let's just get right in. This is A Very Brave Witch by Allison McGee and Harry Bliss. This is not one of the ones that I will be keeping on my shelves. It is a Halloween book and there is a lot of atmosphere built within the illustrations. However, half of the book there is no plot to, and the second half of the book, the plot is just barely there. I wish that we had taken more time with the actual story for some world building instead of just it being cute. So I gave this 2 out of 5 stars. This is The Black Cat by Alan Alberg and Andre Amstutz. Probably butchered the names. So this is a very young reader book with very simple text and words. Kind of made for a bit of a boring read, but it's also nice to have some picture books that don't require an adult to read them to the young child. The thing I really liked about this was twofold. One, that the main characters are skeletons, but a lot of this book takes place in snowy scenes, and I thought this would be a great book to read with a child post-Halloween but pre-Christmas. And secondly, I really appreciated how colors ended up being a big part of this story and the plot. For instance, when they're sledding, the skeletons end up losing body parts and they can't find their white bones in the snow. I do wish that the Black Cat had figured more heavily within the story itself, but does kind of punctuate the end of the book. So overall, I thought this was really simple, but also quite charming, and I will be keeping this on my shelves. I then read The Little House by Virginia Lee Burton, which I really enjoyed. I will insert pictures of some of the illustrations since I don't have the book with me here right now. This is the story of a house in the country and how the country around it evolves throughout the decades. The illustrations are, I think, watercolor and so incredibly detailed and, as far as I can tell, historically accurate. I really loved how you got to compare not only how the seasons changed the countryside, but then also technology as civilization slowly creeps in. This is even there with the end papers. The thesis of this book is that country living is better than city living, which I think is definitely a more privileged sort of attitude. However, this was originally written in the 1940s, so I think I can kind of forgive that. This was a delightful surprise, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars and definitely will be keeping it on my shelves. This is Dragon in the Cupboard by Karen Dolby and Caroline Church. As this says at the top, this is a puzzle adventure book, so with each section of the story, you have an illustration that you need to find something in or find a path through. It's very interactive, and it very much feels like that is the main purpose of this book rather than the story. The two children characters don't matter all that much, and the story surrounding the dragon being lost and needing to find his way home is a little bit boring. And the illustration style was pretty good, but not enough for me to really be engaged. So 2 out of 5 stars, I will not be keeping it. This is Baby in a Basket by Gloria and Ted Rand. This is based on true events in which a mother and her 2 young children were traveling through sleigh through Alaska to try to get to Washington. And something bad happens, with a miraculous ending. My main complaint about this one is that the story does not really have a beginning or an end. It felt very much like the author was concerned with this specific instance and not about exploring the characters themselves or actually wrapping up the story past the miraculous ending. The illustrations were also really creepy at times. Who wants to see a crazy horse eye like that? And this image will haunt my adult dreams, let alone a child's nightmares. If this book had 1 or 2 additional pages of let's introduce you to these characters and let's show you what their life is like in Washington, I would have been happier. That wasn't the case though, so I will not be keeping this on my shelves. 2 out of 5 stars from me. This is How Do Dinosaurs Say Goodnight by Jane Yolen and Mark Teague. This is one of those plotless children's books that have beautiful illustrations and are just surrounding a theme. In this one, the dinosaurs represent the different tantrums that kids may have when they're told to go to bed, with a little bitty baby resolution at the end. The cool thing is that each of the dinosaurs are labeled within the illustrations. So for instance, with this spread, you can see that it's a pterodon down here in the blocks. I also appreciated that the different parental figures throughout this book are racially diverse. However, it doesn't really have that much of a plot. I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars, and I'm up in the air about whether or not I'm keeping this. I like the illustrations, but is that enough to keep a book on my shelves? This is The Littlest Pumpkin by R.A. Herman and Bettina Ogden. This is the story of the smallest pumpkin at the farmer's market who really wants to be a jack-o'-lantern but keeps getting overlooked when children come to pick their pumpkins. I enjoyed how every time a child chose a pumpkin, we got to see how they're planning on carving their jack-o'-lanterns, which would give a young reader an idea of how they could carve their jack-o'-lantern. However, the climax of this story culminates in tiny little mice throwing a Halloween party and taking knives to the littlest pumpkin, and the pumpkin being happy with this, and there was just something so horrifying about the idea of this adorable pumpkin who has had a face the whole time suddenly being carved up and being happy about it. So I just couldn't really get on board with it at the end, so 2 stars, won't be keeping, kind of horrifying. This is Where's the Halloween Treat by Harriet Ziefert and Richard Brown. This is a very simple flap book and counting book. However, this was one of the books I remember reading in my childhood, and as I was flipping through it as an adult, could remember the ideas I had about, ooh, what would that lollipop taste like? Or what do I think is in that bag that the kids just got? So mostly for nostalgia reasons, I will be keeping this on my shelves, and I rated it 3 out of 5 stars. This is Happy Birthday Little Witch by Deborah Hotzig and Mark Brown. This is apparently the second book in a series, which I didn't realize. So things I liked about this book were the Halloween-y sort of illustrations, and also the fact that Little Witch is raised by a bunch of different witches with different personalities, and those are celebrated in how different they are, rather than like one witch being preferred and the other one's not being valued. However, for this book having Halloween flavors, it's about the little witch going and trying to find her friends, so it didn't have a really Halloween-y plot. This one I rated 3 out of 5 stars, and I haven't decided if I want to keep it or not. This is The Little Mermaid, which was adapted by Anthea Bell, though it was originally a Hans Christian Andersen story, and famously illustrated by Chihiro Iwasaki. I've had this on my shelves since childhood as part of my mermaid book collection, but again, I'm trying to purge my shelves and really looking at my mermaid book collection and want to make sure that it's cultivated. I went through and reread this and realized that the illustrations were not my jam. So for me to keep a mermaid book on my shelves, especially a Little Mermaid retelling, I really have to connect with the illustrations. And I just don't do that with this one, so I think it needs to go to a new home. I rated this 3 out of 5 stars, but it's not one of the tops of my mermaid collection, so I won't keep it. You may remember seeing this on my channel a couple years ago. I reread this, so I probably talked about it before. What this story is trying to be is a historical nonfiction book about the bear that inspired Winnie the Pooh. But throughout this story is a frame narrative of blatantly the author telling her son Cole this story of this bear Winnie. And then at the end you realize it's because it's her great-grandfather who was the soldier who found this bear in a train station in Canada and then eventually released that bear to a London zoo. And at the very end of this, it's very clear that the author is just trying to show her son Cole just how special he is. That's a great thing for a parent to do, but you don't have to do that and then publish it for all of the world to read. The framing narrative also just broke up the flow of the story and was sickly sweet and annoying. On top of that, unfortunately, the illustrations of the people are super uncanny valley. And even though this is a story of a bear, there are a lot of people in this story, and some of them are horrifying. If I was in love with the illustrations, I might have overlooked the bragging subplot of this book, but because I neither enjoyed half of the narrative nor most of the illustrations, I'm not going to keep it anymore. I originally rated this 3 out of 5 stars, but I've dropped it to 2. And finally, we have P is for Pterodactyl, the worst alphabet book ever by Raj Halder and Chris Carpenter, with pictures by Maria Tina Badia. She's got a fun name, Maria Tina Badia. So this is an alphabet book, but with every letter of the alphabet, we have examples of words that do not use that letter in its typical form. So for instance, we have A is for aisle. The bread aisle has not been cleaned in eons, and 9 tiny beasts meet to have a feast. So not only do we have aisle as being a word that begins with A but doesn't actually say A or A. In this description, we also have the word bread, which has an A that is silent. We have cleaned, which has an A that is silent. We have eons, I assume this is the British way, that has an A that is silent. Beasts, and also feast with silent A's. All of the different letters of the alphabet do similar things, and I especially liked V, which says V is for 5 and talks about Roman numerals. And then bonus, at the very back of this book is a glossary which tells you how to pronounce these words, which are outlaws and sometimes they're obscure and maybe even an adult wouldn't know how to pronounce it. And it also defines these words. This is a really fun and clever alphabet book that really goes the extra mile to make this a learning experience. I highly enjoyed this and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I will be keeping it. So those were all of the children's books and 2 adult books that I read that were not part of Springathon or part of a middle grade series. Again, those other videos will be linked down below. Please Please let me know in the comments down below if you have a beloved children's book that I need to check out once the libraries reopen. Thank you for watching, and until next time, continue to be lovely.